This is a presentation on planning and development. And there are two types of planning that I talk about in each chapter. One is kind of conventional plans to build highways or railroads or streetcar lines, park systems or whatever. And then there's the vernacular, generic template that each era has that gets carried out not by municipalities, but by the private sector, the development community. What are the development types of that particular area? And I'm going to go through that. And for each of these chapters, each for these sections, I'm trying to make a book that's useful to planners and academics and students, but also to the general public. I do provide sites that people can see for each of these eras that are still notable, so they can go out and do their own exploration. I'm trying to give others a foundation, a launch pad to better explore this particular region. So here I am, traditional town centers, which really isn't suburbanization. And people may not realize this, but the Colonial town center was not really the town center that we know today. There was a meeting house, but the greens didn't amount to much. There weren't other institutions. And it's only after the Revolution, after 1800, that the traditional New England town center develops, with the green and the meeting house, the schools, commercial buildings, wealthy people building their homes around it. And we have a number of communities around Boston, which do then form the core, the nucleus of suburbia. But not necessarily. Obviously, you've got these towns throughout New England. They aren't necessarily suburbs. Here we are, an example here, right here in Cambridge, back before we had automobiles and cars and buses and everything else going through Harvard Square and cutting up Cambridge Common. And then what I call Proto Suburbs. A fellow named Henry Binford wrote a book on suburbs before the Civil War in Boston. And if you kind of take a look from 1800 to 1860, there's just kind of a lot of spilling out from Boston of various activities and urban functions that could no longer be taken care of in Boston. Kind of light industry, farming, dairying. Some of the activities that I particularly find interesting are the cattle markets. You've got one in Brighton, you've got one in Porter Square out here, where they just drive in the livestock, you drive it in on today's Mass Ave, bring it to Porter Square, and then they have the slaughter yards there. So all these different activities, which kind of this creeping suburbanization, but not the suburbia that we have today. So country retreats. This is really the beginning of it. Again, I started about 1820, but certainly you could go back into the 18th century, where you had wealthy, powerful people who had a home in Boston. Boston was pretty crammed, and it was ideal to move out to the countryside. And the countryside was right nearby. You didn't have to go far. Brookline, Cambridge was the countryside, certainly before the Civil War. They would have a home in downtown Boston, and then a second home in the country, which could be often farming, model horticulture, etc. Here we are, the Gardner's house, Isabella Stewart Gardner's family, Green Hill. Not that they were there in 1806, but they got there by the 1840s, and it wasn't necessarily her family, her husband's family. And it's right near the Olmsted House today. There's another example here. Again, take a look through Greater Boston, see these earlier layers. The Lyman Estate in Waltham, which is a property of, which one is it? Historic New England? Yeah. And then Belmont nearby. This is gone now, but this was built by a man named Cushing, wealthy merchant in 1840. Belmont didn't exist at the time. There was a bit of Watertown, a bit of Waltham, bit of what's today Arlington. They cut it off, they put it together in 1859, created Belmont, and it was called Belmont because Mr. Cushing put up the money to create this new community of Belmont. So just to go back to this, you've got all these, and I could give a whole talk just on this particular era. But it kind of sets a tone for people to think, middle-class people, whatever, to aspire. Gee, someday I'd like to have a place outside the city with some land or whatever, and kind of it gets people thinking about that, which then we move into the post-World War II era, and everybody wants their quarter acre or sixth of an acre in their backyard. And of course, you can extend this area here. I had 1920, certainly Weston, Lincoln, Dover. Those are communities that still have a lot of this sort of landscape. Now, railroad suburbs, I think this is certainly one of the most significant aspects of Greater Boston's development. In 1834, the first railway trip out from Boston left downtown, and it was going to be the Boston-Worcester line, but the first trip just ended in West Newton, and that was in 1834. It went on to Worcester subsequently, and actually they built railroad lines for the next couple of years out to Providence and Newburyport and Lowell, whatever. And the system that we have today of commuter rail was really in place going back to the 1830s. And here we are. If you know West Newton, this is the Sweet Tomatoes Pizza Parlor, and this brick building here was the first railroad terminus in Boston's history. And it's interesting because Newton is this very early, you could call it the best example of a railroad suburb. Newton, being a Newtonite and a resident of Newtonville, Newton has this thing where it loves to call its neighborhoods villages. And people really, nobody calls it neighborhoods. It doesn't have one town center. It's got supposedly 13 of these villages. And it's very much created by each stop on the railroad. So here's an example here. The first, I don't think I have it in this presentation, the first residential subdivision off of a railroad line that I've been able to identify is in Brookline, 1843. But this is 1844. This is Walnut Park, Newton Corner. And if you know the Jackson Homestead, which is the home of the Newton Historical Society, it's a historic house. It's owned by Congressman, it was the home of Congressman Jackson, William Jackson. And he, back in 1834, got the railroad line to come through Newton. The planners wanted to put it on the north side of the Charles River through Watertown and Waltham, but they didn't really want it. And he said, geez, let's bring it through Newton. So if I might just step over here, this is the Boston-Worcester, whatever you want to call it, railroad line, which still exists. You can take the commuter rail in any day. Here's the Jackson Homestead, and here's how we subdivided it out back. He had Alexander Wadsworth, who was someone who helped plan a number of subdivisions and also helped lay out the Mount Auburn Cemetery. So this is 1844, and this is kind of interesting. When the railroads were started in the 1830s, everybody thought it was going to be for commercial freight or maybe some long distance travel. Nobody was thinking about suburbanization, but very quickly, people who were living in the city said, you mean I can live a half-hour train ride out of the city and live in a nice lot, an acre or whatever, and then commute in and be downtown? Hey, that's a great idea. And people started thinking about that during the 1830s, and by the early 1840s, they went to the railroad line and they said, gee, I'm riding this line every day. Can I get a discount on my ticket? And they said, okay, we'll issue a pass, a yearly pass, and we'll call it a commuted fare. So you'll be a commuter. Now, everybody thinks today that a commuter is somebody driving on Route 128, but it's that discounted railroad fare that was introduced in the early 1840s, specifically to serve people like this living in today's Newton Corner. And here's Newton as a railroad suburb. You see all these little names, place names, and almost all of them are centers that were railroad stops in the mid-19th century and still are. Now, since we're in Cambridge, I thought I'd come up with here this I found at the Boston Public Library, and it's a wonderful little plan because it draws you in. It's a promotional piece. It isn't just to show the subdivision here on the right. This is today's Mass Ave. You can see diagonally cutting across. This is the railroad line, which is the Fitchburg line today, and they're developing this street with these lots right near the station, 1860. And I love the little picture here. It's this kind of sylvan place, today's Mass Ave out near Porter Square. You can see way in the far left distance, that's a horse-drawn streetcar coming along. And that's the image that they were trying to sell to people who were living crammed in, jammed in Boston to come out to the suburbs of Cambridge. And then I'm not going to say too much about Frederick Olmsted right here. He's going to be woven through my piece. He ended up moving in the early 1880s to Brookline. Was it because it was a railroad suburb? Was it because it was an estate suburb? It was a little of both.